One of the major effects of European imperialism was the complete restructuring of local economies because Europeans always preferred their own plants and animals to the native variations. And so they completely transform the local agriculture and the local economy. And they convert agriculture basically to become uh, agriculture for export. And so these economies become dependent on these cash crops and they destroy a lot of centuries old traditions when it comes to farming and economies. And they basically create a situation that leads to economic dependency. And the best example of this is India, where India for centuries had been known for growing their own cotton and producing their own finished textiles and then exporting those finished textiles. Well, Britain is going to completely transform that. And now India is exporting raw cotton to Britain, where they manufacture the textiles and then sell finished British textiles back to India. But this was not the only example. This happened all around the globe because Europe wanted to keep these territories dependent on Europe. And they wanted to keep all of the manufacturing and all of the industries back in Europe as well. And so some other examples of this, the rainforest of Ceylon are going to be cleared out. And most of Ceylon, which is modern day Sri Lanka, is going to be converted into tea plantations. And the natives there are going to be used as laborers on those plantations and paid very low wages for their work. Rubber plantations are going to spread to Southeast Asia and parts of the Congo. And again, the natives did not benefit from these raw materials. All of these raw materials were going back to Europe. In Hawaii, their economy is going to become dependent on the exports of sugar and pineapple, most of it going back to the United States. In Africa and the Americas, coffee and sugar plantations are going to spread. In Argentina and Brazil, grain and cattle are going to be exported back to Europe and the United States. And so all of these economies become dependent on the West. And this is a problem that plagues many parts of the world today. It's this legacy of European imperialism. So when we look at the kind of cultural and social effects, new hierarchies were established. And under these new hierarchies, the Europeans or Americans were always at the top. And they tended to live in the capitals, and they created these capitals that become very similar to what they had back in Europe. They create European-style buildings. They bring in European culture because that's what they preferred. And they also, as Europe took over territories, they often created new boundaries that cut across older ethnic and tribal boundaries. And this meant that now rival groups were in the same territory. And this is going to plague parts of Africa, especially in the next era as they gain independence. Because as they gained independence, many parts of Africa kept these old boundaries in place, basically because they didn't want to cause even more problems. But that meant that these rival groups were now part of the same nation. And so that's going to lead to future issues as well. We're also going to see a spread of what we call scientific racism. And this kind of goes back to the idea of the civilizing mission and social Darwinism. And so Europeans actually used what they called at the time science, but they used science to try to prove that Europeans were superior to these native peoples. And they had scientific books and studies that showed that the Europeans were indeed the superior race. And so they used that to justify Europeans dominating these other peoples. So over time, we're going to see growing nationalism spread. And first, within European nations, because as European nations competed with each other, that's going to lead to a spread of national pride. But as Europe took over territories, it's going to cause nationalism to spread amongst the native peoples. And Europe is going to introduce Western-style schools in some of these regions, especially India and parts of Africa. And as they introduce these European-style schools, usually your native elites would attend these schools and they would learn about European nationalism. And they would learn about these European ideas and then use that to fuel their own desires for self-rule. So one good example of this is India. India is going to be one of the leaders when it comes to pushing for independence and an end to British imperialism. And so Ram Mohan Roy is known as the father of modern India. And he was a social reformer who tried to seek a balance between European science and keeping traditional Hinduism. And so he was great at using the newspapers to spread his ideas. And he's going to be one of the leaders that helps push for things like an outlawing of the sati, which ultimately they would get with British help. He's going to push for Indian freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and also argued against the caste system. We're also going to see the creation of the Indian National Congress. This was a group of educated elites who met with British approval to basically just discuss public affairs. And that's what it kind of started as. But over time, they started to air their grievances to the British. They began to speak up more for Indian self-rule and even started to lead things like boycotts of British goods and encourage native Indian peoples to support Indian-made goods instead. We're also going to see the creation of the All India Muslim League. This was a group that was formed by the Muslim population of India, and they wanted to basically push for the rights of the Muslim populations of India. And what they were afraid of was that eventually, if India gained their independence, that they would be dominated by the Hindus. And so what they really began pushing for is a separate Muslim nation state to be created within India. And so again, India kind of gets a head start on everybody else when it comes to growing nationalism and growing resistance to European rule. And ultimately, they wouldn't get what they want until after World War II. But we're going to see between World War I and World War II, this push for self-rule continue to grow.